So we're going to move on. Thank you for that. And our next speaker has really changed drug policy around the world, and he's actually made it make sense. Ethan Nadelmann is the founder of the Drug Policy Alliance, a legendary harm reductionist, and a tireless champion for treating addiction as a health issue, not a criminal one. His TED Talk has now over 2 million views, and you want to hear Ethan speak, and his podcast, Psychoactive, is a must-listen for anyone who wants to rethink what justice actually means. If anyone can talk about what comes after the war on drugs, it's Ethan. I'd like you to please welcome the policy rock star himself, Ethan Nadelmann.
Damn, missed the words of Leonard Cohen's song. Well, it's good to be here. I'm going to talk about the broader issue of drug policy, and it's great to follow both the presentation by Karim about psychedelics and the other marshmallow circle over here about addiction and pain. I should say I'm coming at this from a couple of perspectives. One is just vis-a-vis Canada. One is I started college even though I'm a New Yorker, I started college 50 years ago at McGill. And so I have some Canadian university experience. And the other part is that in my own work, Canada was at times a role model for what we should do in the United States. And I came up here often. I had allies in Canada. You know, I testified before your Canadian Senate. I advised the Vancouver mayors going back to Philip Owen and Sam Sullivan and Larry Campbell and Gregor Robertson, and working with activists here and professionals and what have you. And lastly, as somebody coming from the southern colossus beneath your border, I do want to apologize. Although for us, many of us see your recent election results as perhaps the only great silver lining so far in the election of Donald Trump in my country. And I wish your Prime Minister all the best luck when he meets with our president next Tuesday and who accuses him of having to have tariffs because you haven't done enough on the fentanyl issue. But good luck with that. Now, I also come from this from a perspective of pain from two perspectives. One is a personal experience with pain, who had 3 severe attacks of lower back pain and sciatica, got diagnosed with L4, L5, L5S1, herniated disc. At the age of 34, was 2 days away from having surgery. A friend of mine was Andrew Weil. How many of you have heard of Andrew Weil, kind of leader in integrative medicine? I encourage you to look him up. Sort of a pioneer of integrative medicine. And he told me to read a book by a fellow named John Sarno called Healing Back Pain. How many of you heard of the book by John Sarno called Healing Back Pain? I encourage all of you to read it. For me, it was an extraordinary cure that put my back pain and sciatica behind me and that transformed my understanding of the mind-body relationship. So even if you didn't get every fact right there, it was monumental for me. On the other hand, it's also the case that in becoming motivated to oppose the war on drugs, the issue of opioids and opiophobia was a major issue that we had to deal with. In trying to build an organization and a political movement to end the war on drugs and the punitive prohibitionist policies associated with it, one of the issues among the dozens in which the war on drugs was screwing up good public policy was in the area of pain management and the opiophobia that was pervasive, the massive undertreatment, right, especially of acute pain, but even the ways of failing to think creatively about chronic pain. And so that issue became part of my own consciousness in mobilizing people and building coalitions of people working on diverse areas to try to come up with rational policies. Now, when I speak about drug policy reform, I should say that, you know, maybe 30% of the work of my organization, Drug Policy Alliance, was focused on cannabis reform, medical marijuana, reducing marijuana arrests, getting rid of the racially biased arrests, and ultimately responsible policy of controlled legalization of cannabis. The second 30% was focused on taking on mass incarceration and the ways in which the war on drugs was driving mass incarceration and reducing the role of mass incarceration in my country. And the third was treating drug use and addiction as a health issue, not a criminal issue, right? The harm reduction approach, which began with the work around needle exchange and access to sterile syringes to reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS and Hep C and other things like that, and then moved into the area of overdose prevention, increasing the availability of naloxone and Good Samaritan laws and all of that, and educating Americans about proper approaches in European countries. And am I talking too quickly for you as a New Yorker? Am I talking too quickly? I could slow it down. Nah. Okay. And I should say Canada, at various points, was a role model. I mean, I have to say, in 2003, at our biennial conference, we put Canada up on the main stage, right? We gave our biggest award to two mayors of Canada, Philip Owen, who sacrificed his political career to advance safe injection sites, and Larry Campbell, who was a major leader and then became a leader in the Senate, and a remarkable member of the Conservative Party from Quebec, Pierre-Claude Nolan, who had really been the champion of sensible drug policy in a very peculiar way in the early part of this century, right? So we know that Canada was a major leader, and then the embarrassment for so many of our Canadian allies when your Stephen Harper became Prime Minister, and then we got Obama, who finally opened up to progressive drug policy, at least in his second term. So my hope is when I look at Canada, we've oftentimes looked at Canada as a role model, as an inspiration for doing the right thing in the United States, whether it was about harm reduction, whether it was about, to some extent, about cannabis, and a whole range of other areas. Even on psychedelics, some of the openness around psychotherapists prescribing or using psilocybin and other substances like that here is a positive development for us. Now, it's also been true of Canada that although you've never been as harsh and as terrible as the United States, I've heard Canadian allies say, you know, when it comes to drug policy in Canada, this was some years ago, and especially with respect to cannabis, that our bite is worse than our bark. In other words, we talk like we're being gentle, but in fact, our policies are far more punitive than they were in Western Europe, although nothing like the way they were in the United States, right? Now, I want to dig down into a few specific drug policies. First of all, with respect to cannabis, I've been involved in this for just about 40 years, right? The fact that Canada became about 7 years ago, right, the second country in the world after Uruguay to legalize cannabis nationally. I mean, we in the United States took the lead on the legalization, right? Medical marijuana, the medical marijuana strategy we pioneered in 1996 and in the late 90s helps explain the paradox of the fact that the United States, the global champion of the war on drugs for the last century, nonetheless became the global leader when it came to legally regulating cannabis. But the fact that Canada leaped forward and became the second country after Uruguay to do it, I think is something to really be applauded. And I have to say that as we worry, as cannabis use becomes more common, we know cannabis is a drug, we know people can have a problem with cannabis, we know cannabis can cause elements of delusion and other sorts of problems, but let's not forget that the number one reason we moved forward on the legalization of cannabis was to end the negative consequences of cannabis prohibition, to end the hundreds of thousands of people being arrested, primarily young people of color, to end all of the sorts of ways in which people were being punished in the civil system, fired from their jobs because of drug testing that had nothing to do with their capabilities in the job place, inhibiting the role of research into medical marijuana. That, keep in mind, as the media looks for the new stories about cannabis being the new terrible drug or how cannabis has changed so much, don't forget why we need to always turn our back on cannabis prohibition, and that the challenge needs to be to understand the ways in which we can maximize its benefits and minimize its harms. Right? If you think about it, the broader framework of drug policy and harm reduction is accepting the historical fact that there's never been a drug-free society, more or less, in human history, that there's never going to be one, that we have no choice but to learn how to live with these substances so they cause the least possible harm and, in some cases, the greatest possible benefit. That ultimately drug policies need to be driven by values grounded in science, health, compassion, and human rights. That needs to be the basic framework. It's also understanding that when you as medical practitioners or health practitioners are looking at the people in front of you, you're also looking at, you're part of a bigger puzzle, a bigger piece, where what also matters is what's happening with respect to the social welfare system and the criminal justice system, what's happening with respect to illicit markets, what's happening with respect to human rights. Part of my role in sort of, playing a role in building a drug policy reform movement in the U.S. and around the world was understanding that we needed to integrate all of these sorts of things. It needed to understand that when we pushed for harm reduction policies, for safe injection or needle exchange or safe supply approaches to dealing, with drug addiction and the reality of fentanyl, that at the same time we did that and pushed at it from a public health and a human rights perspective, we had to understand that our best allies needed to be the police and law enforcement, because if they were not bought into this as well, ultimately this thing was not going to succeed. Safe injection sites, safe supply policies. I don't know in Canada. I think the problem here is you haven't been bold enough about them. I see some of the provincial and urban governments pulling back on safe supply at this point, or in Ontario talking about shutting down safe injection sites, not based upon any evidence that they're doing harm, because the evidence overwhelmingly shows that the safe injection sites, or what we sometimes call overdose prevention centers, are in fact reducing overdose fatalities. But the police need to be bought into this. Communities need to be bought into this, right? It's reasonable to say to somebody who is a struggling street, drug injecting, addict that, listen, we're now providing a safe place for you to use these drugs, and therefore you will be arrested if you are doing this stuff out on the streets and disturbing people who are walking around and scaring their kids and all this sort of stuff. It's about finding the effective compromises in our society. Now, I want to throw out a provocative point to you as well. When it comes to something like fentanyl, fentanyl was such a game changer, right? Until fentanyl came around, the vast majority of opioid overdoses were not a result of people simply taking too much heroin. They were typically a result of people using heroin in combination with alcohol or benzos or other drugs. They were more accurately defined as toxic or fatal drug combinations. Fentanyl changed that. Fentanyl all by itself could kill you, right? Fentanyl was a game. Now, if we ask about the emergence of illicit fentanyl in my country and yours, and how and why that happened, we see some of it's just the ingenuity and venality of the illicit market and the narcos and all of that. But I want to throw an interesting question to you just to think about. We blame typically the Purdue farmers and the pharmaceutical companies for their overpromotion, right, and of OxyContin and other things. And that was definitely played a significant role, beginning at the start of this century. But we also know that what happened as we became increasingly effective in cracking down on the pharmaceutical companies and cracking down on physicians who were prescribing opioids, both legitimately and illegitimately, we saw the emergence of Mexican heroin coming into the country. And then we saw the emergence of fentanyl. So a little policy question to throw your way. Imagine if the crackdown on pharmaceutical opioids had been much less intense. Would that have resulted in fentanyl not emerging in its stead? Would, from a policy and health perspective, would we have been better off with a leaky pharmaceutical drug control system than a tight drug control system that severely restricted pharmaceutical opioids and opened the door to fentanyl? Now, I'm not saying that we can construct a policy based upon a leaky pharmaceutical prescription control system. But it does raise the question of thinking always about the unintended consequences of the policies for which we advocate. In the same ways that we launched a drug war based upon the notion that we can keep drugs out of this country or we can punish enough people that will reduce drug use without thinking about the death, disease, crime, and suffering, the corruption, the violence, the organized crime, the overfilling jails and prison cells, and all of that resulted from that. Right? Always thinking about the unintended consequences of the policies, right, which we think may do some good. When it comes to cannabis, it means staying open to this. Is it possible that when you combine cannabis and opioids, you can reduce the level of opioids you're prescribing because of cannabis's enhancement effect? To what extent will, in fact, cannabis emerge as being beneficial for certain types of pain? I loved hearing Kareem talk about the psychedelics, and I agree with everything he's doing and support it wholeheartedly. Randomized controlled trials are pivotally important as we move forward. But what about the lived experiences of tens or hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people saying, I had that psychedelic experience. I didn't even have a guide. I did it, and something changed in my life. Something changed with my depression or my pain or my addiction or what have you. When we look at the human cases and reports with ibogaine and psilocybin and 5-MeO-DMT and MDMA, it's remarkable what's out there. And of course, the studies and trials are showing that. But to be in the position of telling people, these things have virtually no addictive potential and we need to try them and give them a go, of course, why not? Different strokes for different folks. If things have worked from everything from indigenous people going thousands of years to people living in any which way today, let's try it. And now, since I don't think I've been sufficiently provocative, I want to hit you with one other thing. Since I stopped running my organization, Drug Policy Alliance, 8 years ago, the issue that I've become most impassioned about is the issue of tobacco harm reduction. The importance of getting people who smoke to switch, if they cannot quit, to non-combustible forms of nicotine, whether they're the e-cigarettes or the heat-not-burn products, or whether they're snus or the nicotine pouches you put here. Right, where the evidence is overwhelming about these things being dramatically less dangerous than combustible smoking. When you have over 1 billion people worldwide smoking cigarettes and dying prematurely from smoking-related ills, to expedite the transition from that to non-combustible forms of nicotine, which carry dramatically fewer risks, well, we should be doing everything possible to make that happen, even if some of these products appeal to younger people. For how long was the entire war on drugs, the policies of mass incarceration, the blocking of all sorts of progressive health-based policies justified as one great big child protection act? And today, the justification for opposing tobacco harm reduction and encouraging adults to switch to non-combustibles if they cannot quit is once again falsely put out there as one great big child protection act. In fact, the risk to young people of taking up, e-cigarettes or these things, it's real. But compared to the benefits of adults switching who have been smoking and adults who could not find any other way to switch, this is a fundamental public health issue today for us to be on board of. I am so disillusioned when I look at my liberal political allies who supported me and supported our efforts on medical marijuana and marijuana legalization and harm reduction and reducing incarceration, et cetera, but then leading the way to ban vaping. No. When I look at smoking rates are over 50% among people struggling with mental illness, and yet the organization supposedly advocating mentally ill oppose tobacco harm reduction? On what basis? This is a policy, if we move rapidly enough, let me put it as boldly as I possibly can. If we could switch from a world in which 1 billion people are smoking cigarettes, with a huge percentage of them dying prematurely, and maybe 100 million are using non-combustible forms of nicotine, to a world in which we cut that 1 billion down to 1 or 200 million people smoking, while at the same time the people using nicotine in a non-combustible form goes up to 500 million, or even 1 billion, or even more than 1 billion, from a public health perspective, it would represent one of the greatest successes in human history. Punchline here, when you're dealing with pain, one of the most honorable, dealing with the management of pain, I think the courage it requires, the sense of nuance of dealing with people right in front of you, the understanding that whatever works must be tried so long as it is reasonable. At the same time, it's incumbent upon you to keep your eyes and your ears open on everything, from the non-pharmaceutical versions of dealing with pain and managing pain, to all of the things ranging from the psychedelics and cannabis and other things, and who knows, even nicotine, but all of these things, it's about keeping your mind open to the ways in which other areas of drug policy are as or more flawed even than they are in this area, and understanding and hopefully perceiving yourselves as part of a broader movement to deal with drugs in our society from the basis of science, compassion, health, and human rights. Thank you very much.
No, don't go. We have questions for you. Don't go. We have questions. So
okay.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. A flood of questions has come in, as well as many compliments. Major props for this talk. It was spectacular, said someone. Here's one of the questions. In the interest of time, we'll just do one question. Why does alcohol not get the same level of scrutiny if it can be just as bad?
I mean, alcohol is the devil we know. It's the one we've all learned to love. It's part of our society and part of our culture. And even though it's harms, if you look at look at David Nutt, the great British drug researcher and scientist, briefly the head of the British Advisory Council, and he ranks the orders of the dangers of drugs, and alcohol is right near the top. So I think it's just that it is so profoundly part of our culture. Even when alcohol was banned, in my country, you still have more people using alcohol dramatically than cannabis, for example. I am delighted, however, to see in some states now you see alcohol consumption jumping very substantially among all age groups, and so oftentimes being replaced with cannabis, which, although not perfectly safe, is dramatically safer than alcohol for most people.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.